Okay, so today I'm going to be covering African and African American trickster stories. By the way, I'm Atlas Collins. So the contents, basically how I'm going to break this presentation down, is the introduction, the history of the myths, the differences between the African trickster myth and the African American trickster myth, some examples, one of each of those two categories, followed by observations for each of those myths. Then we will conclude. So the history of the African American and African trickster myths, obviously it originated in Africa. And because of the slave trade, a lot of these myths, these stories, cultural practices, things like that, they migrated over, because of the enslavement of the peoples, they were forced over. But they went westward from Africa, and mostly what we're going to focus on today is the American South and the West Indies or the Caribbean. But these myths and these stories, these characters even, they are present in other areas of the Americas. But like I said, we're just going to focus on the American South and the West Indies, and of course Africa. The trickster characters and the trickster folktales are some of the few surviving practices that actually made it through that transference from Africa to the West, and that was able to endure through slavery, under white supremacy, and still be present even today. The main features of these myths, and right here underneath the title on this slide, I have a little box just kind of outlining these scholars that the textbook directly references and even quotes, and some of those references I've used in the slide, so I wanted to include those scholars: Roger D. Abrahams, J. Edwards, and John W. Roberts. And you can find their references on pages 468 to 72 of the textbook. So the main features of these myths is that they often end in disharmony or even abruptly. They may end via deus ex machina, wherein all complex and unsolvable issues are resolved by a greater or more powerful intervention, like gods, for example, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a god or a divine presence. The plot lines reflect lived experiences, and traditionally, these stories are told orally at gatherings. They often include storytelling contests because it was not a strict, highly structured kind of performance. It was more communal. It wasn't like one person being a professional story reader. It was more a group activity, and there wasn't a really strict structure to how it had to be done. The story itself is actually performed, so there's dancing, there's singing, there's gestures, there's intonations of voice, differentiating characters and emulating or mimicking animals. There was call and response, which again, that's the audience engagement that is very, very common to these types of myth telling. And the story itself, it may not even be told in chronological order or in its entirety. It can be stopped at any time. It can be picked back up later or not. The story, like I said, the scenes and the events, they do not have to be told chronologically, because that ties back into how this is not some professional strict thing. This is a shared experience. And in many cases, the people in these areas have already been exposed to the characters or perhaps the story itself, the events of the story. So a lot of people are already fairly aware of generally what's going on. So the focus on exposition is not very strong at all. There also isn't a strong focus on plot necessarily, because again, the story can be told in parts. It can be told then not completed. It can be told completely out of chronological order. It's really more of an artistic expression of storytelling rather than a strict rule of how to make a quote-unquote good story. These performances are often accompanied by other songs that are not necessarily the story itself being sung, but other songs being included, dance performances, games, and other audience-involved activities. So again, that ties back to it being a communal kind of experience. And the pictures we have here, the one on the top left, that's Anansi. Looks like he may be in woman form here. That is something that he can do. And then on the upper right is I believe it's Brer Rabbit. That's another trickster figure, although I did not include one of those myths. I just wanted to show a kind of representation that there are different trickster characters within the myths. The themes and characteristics of the trickster and the trickster stories, it's mostly around disruption of order. So the trickster themselves primarily disrupts the order and the control of those in power, especially, although the trickster really does not discriminate very much. I'll get into that at the bottom of this slide here. I'll talk a little more about what I mean by that. But the trickster, a lot of the times, he's subverting those in power, or he's subverting a system in power. So the trickster, because of this, often represents the weak, less powerful, and insignificant, outwitting and triumphing over the more powerful. The trickster is a chaotic and imperfect type of hero, so that ties into the trickster triumphing over or outwitting a group of power, a system of power, people in power, a person in power, whatever it is. The textbook says that the stories about tricksters allow the tellers to deal with ethical and social dilemmas in a consistent way. So that really what that means is that the trickster allowed the storyteller to challenge boundaries of society and structures that are in power, or people, groups that are in power, but doing it in a safe way, doing it through art and through communication, doing it in a way that was expressive but not direct. It was like they were able to project what they were feeling and thinking onto and through this trickster character. The main characteristics of the trickster is that he's always cunning and witty. He guiles in human endeavors. That is a huge thing. And he loves violating the boundaries set by society. This relates to him being a hero character, because oftentimes those boundaries in society can be quite oppressive to certain groups or certain members, and the structure of society, the boundaries within that society, not just the people in control, but the structure that society is. It can be very limiting. And so violating those boundaries is in a way a form of liberation. The trickster himself, his motivations are actually neutral. He's not a moral character in the sense that his motivations are not spurred by what he feels is right and wrong, what is just, what is righteous, what is moral or amoral. He's actually primarily fueled by his love of pushing boundaries and his love for creating chaos. The trickster actually, most often he will betray a human dupe. This makes the human the dupe, or he chimps to, and he's caught, disgraced, which reverses the role and essentially makes the trickster the dupe. On the next slide, differences and similarities between African and African American trickster myths. So I have it separated here on the slide, two different sections, African and African American. I'm going to go each bullet point from each, kind of going back and forth to show the differences and the similarities. So to start, the African trickster, obviously Africa is the originator. So the Native American trickster, especially the ones that I'm covering, they came from Africa. And for the African American, it spread to the Americas because of slavery. For the African trickster myth, it focused on social issues such as scarcity and hardship, whereas the African American trickster myth focused on social issues that included scarcity and hardship, but also there was a large focus on the social injustice, slavery, privation, which is essentially the deprivation of needs and wants. So, I mean, just basic needs not being met, even things to make life more enjoyable or more livable are systematically denied to the enslaved peoples. So that's where the privation comes in, and there is a focus on that. That is what causes the scarcity. And so the next point is actually scarcity is caused by slavery in the African American trickster myth, whereas in the African trickster myth, the scarcity is caused by war and natural disaster. And we will see a difference in the two myths that I'm going to cover here in a little bit. In the African trickster myth, the biggest threat to cultural values was magic. Dark magic, evil magic, however you want to look at it. It was an unnatural manipulation of the natural order of things or nature, however you want to kind of break it down. It was essentially magic, just having that power. And the trickster uses his cunning and his wit to overcome this and other threats. Whereas in the African American trickster myth, the biggest threat was white supremacy and enslavement. And so the trickster uses or even encourages the enslaved person's cunning to outwit the master or the person in power. The African American trickster, because of this, he was able to represent a safe and distanced way to explore and express subversion of white supremacy and slavery. So, like I mentioned in the other slide, it's breaking those boundaries, it's subverting those boundaries, but in a safe way, because it's not directly the enslaved person doing that. That can be incredibly dangerous, if not deadly. And so they found a way to use the trickster stories to express what they were going through as an enslaved group in America. The African trickster story and the African American trickster story are both traditionally told orally and performed at gatherings. However, with the African American trickster myth, we do see slightly more, it's a little more subdued. I wrote on a slide that they kind of practice in a more closeted way, and that just ties back to safety. But the practices themselves were kept alive under remarkable circumstances. And then the next slide, now we're going to cover an example of the African trickster myth. And the example that I chose is the ant's burden. This myth is from the Hausa people of Nigeria and Niger in West Africa. And if you go back to that third slide where I have the African map, you can see Niger and Nigeria right there on the northwestern portion of the continent. So you can kind of see where this particular myth is coming from. The pictures I have on this slide, the top one is the ant carrying a large luggage. That's representative of the ant's burden. You'll see that here on the next slide when I describe what exactly the ant's burden is. Then the image below that is Anansi himself. He is in human form, but you see his shadow has the spider. His shadow is a spider. On his hat, there's a spider. So there's the iconography of that connection to him being the spider trickster. But in many of the myths, he is in human form. So the myth that I've included here, he's in human form. And so now to go over the myth, the ant's burden, it has 4 characters: 2 farmers, a father and a son, a dwarf, and an ant. The farmer's crops are suffering from a drought, and again, this relates to it being more common in the African trickster myth that scarcity is caused by natural disaster or war. The son farmer, Tsen, encounters a dwarf that promises to bring water to his crops if Tsen lightly taps his back with 2 small sticks. Tsen does this, and the dwarf follows through. That is the first example of a contract within the trickster myth. Tsen and the dwarf have a contract. The both members follow through on their portion of the contract, and Sin's farm, his crops actually start to flourish. His father is Anansi, and that's the image right here I have on the left. Anansi is a very significant trickster figure, if not one of the most popular and well-known, particularly here in the West. He's certainly the one that I've known about the longest and the only one that I've really heard about throughout my life. So he's an important character, but here he's a farmer, and he sees that his son has achieved, his crops are actually growing and they're healthy, they're flourishing, despite there being a drought. And so his son tells him that it was because of the contract he made with the dwarf, and that spurs Anansi to go and seek the dwarf. The dwarf and Anansi create the same contract that the dwarf instigated with Sin. However, Anansi, out of his greed, breaks the contract. So instead of hitting the dwarf lightly with two small sticks on the back, Anansi hits the dwarf with two very large sticks, hard enough to kill him, thinking that the larger the stick, the heavier the hit, the more he'll get out of it, the more reward or service he'll get from the dwarf. Unfortunately, this kills the dwarf. The next slide. Realizing that he killed the dwarf, Anansi hides the dwarf's body in a tree because the dwarf is a favorite entertainer of the king, and Anansi knows this. His son finds Anansi standing beneath the tree, and Anansi lies to his son and tells him that the dwarf is up in the tree and Anansi is just waiting for him to come down so that they can do the same exchange that the dwarf and his son Sin did. This kind of manipulates Sin into climbing the tree himself because he thinks, well, I'll just go down and get the dwarf for you. It's okay. And so he climbs the tree to get the dwarf, or to check on the dwarf to see what's going on up there. And as he's climbing the tree, he actually hits the dwarf's body with his head, knocking the dwarf out of the tree. Anansi convinces his son that his son killed the dwarf by knocking the dwarf out of the tree. This is Anansi's attempt at making his son the dupe. Sin, however, is also very clever himself, and he understands that this is one of Anansi's tricks. So Anansi's already known for doing these kind of things. And so he instead tricks his father by claiming that the king is actually angry at the dwarf and wishes the dwarf dead, and he has a reward for anyone who kills the dwarf and brings him his body. Anansi believes this because he hears that there's a financial reward, and again, his greed takes over. He's motivated by that selfish goal and by kind of pushing those boundaries like I mentioned earlier. And so Anansi takes credit and he takes the body to the king. This makes Anansi now the dupe, because when Anansi goes to the king is obviously furious, and he punishes Anansi by forcing Anansi to carry the dwarf's body in a large box upon Anansi's head. And the box is enchanted, so it actually cannot be put down. Anansi is expected to carry this burden for the rest of his life. Anansi is walking a little later with the box on his head, and he meets an ant. And he tricks the ant, telling the ant that Anansi, he has to go to the store really quick just to get some items, and then he'll be back. And when he's back, he'll take the box back from the ant, but he needs the ant to hold the box for now because he can't go to the store with the box otherwise. The ant, it's said in the story that the ant himself, the ant himself is actually really honest and does not believe that Anansi would lie. And so he falls for it, and that makes the ant the dupe. And of course, Anansi never returns. That's the broken contract. This is another example of the contract between Anansi and the ant. Anansi breaks that contract again, never returns, and the ant is forced forever to carry the heavy box on his head. This is an ideological aspect to this myth. It's explaining why ants carry heavy loads, heavy quote-unquote burdens throughout nature. You see real ants in nature actually carrying things multiple times their body size. And this is a way to explain why they do that or how they can do that. And the picture on the side is Anansi again. This is him with the juxtaposition of humanoid and spider-like features, just to show that symbolism again that he is a spider trickster. The next slide. Observations about this myth. The story opening with drought, again, like I mentioned, it represents scarcity being the provocation for the trickster's actions in the African trickster myth. The scarcity is caused by natural disasters. So again, that's very common in these types of myths. It's different than what we're going to see in the African American issue of scarcity, that myth that we're going to cover next. The role of the dupe is reversed here in this myth. It's actually reversed twice. The role is not always reversed in these myths, but there is always a dupe. In this case, the role is reversed twice, and Anansi is the dupe, and then he's not the dupe, and his son is almost the dupe, but he's not, and then the ant really is the dupe at the end. And so you see kind of a switching there, a fluidity of who is the dupe based on manipulation and trickery. Contracts and trickster contest are present here. The contract between the dwarf and Sen, the dwarf and Anansi, which Anansi breaks. He breaks that contract. And then Anansi's contract with the ant, which he also breaks. Those are the contracts included in the story. Then the contest is actually that brief exchange there between Sin and Anansi, where Sin is manipulating. He's deliberately trying to get Anansi to kind of contest with him over the king's reward for the dwarf's death, but it's just a manipulation. Sin is duping Anansi here, but it is metaphorical kind of contest. At least that's how Anansi is perceiving it, because he wants to win. He wants to be the one that gets that reward. And just as on a little side note down here, Anansi the spider is very popular, just like I mentioned before, but he does have variants of his name: Anansi, Nanzi, Anansi with a Z, Nancy, and Anansi. The images over here on the right, they're both of Anansi. The lower one is Anansi speaking to a woman, and you can see that he has a human head, but a spider body. Again, the anthropomorphizing of the spider in a way to represent that this spider is both human and animal, part of nature. The top image, it's the same thing. It's a spider body, but it has a humanoid head. And that represents what the textbook kind of talked about there being a dual kind of identity to Anansi, him being able to be a part of the natural world, this kind of maybe a little mystical, but really just non-human nature, while also being able to interact directly with the human realm and intercept it and kind of invade it in a way and directly affect it and the people therein. So the next example of myth that I'm going to cover is an African American trickster myth. This one is why they named the stories for Anansi. This is from Tobago in the West Indies, and if you go back to that third slide, you'll see down there the picture of the West Indies. Tobago is the tiny, tiny, tiny little island on the very bottom right of the image, that orange island that is almost kissing Venezuela. It's that close to Southern America. That's where this story is originating from. So why they named the stories for Anansi, and this is actually pretty important because many stories are called Anansi stories. So Anansi asks the Master King to make all stories called Anansi stories. And Anansi and the king create a contract. Again, we see the presence of a contract in these myths. If Anansi tricks the clever and witty black snake and brings the black snake extended full length on a pole to the king, then the king will grant Anansi's wish, and he will therefore decree that all stories be called Anansi stories. So Anansi sets out to do this. He tries tricking the black snake by putting a pig in a trap, because he knows that the pig is one of the black snake's favorite foods. However, Because a black snake is, it's said, equally as clever as Anansi, the traps don't work at all. In fact, the black snake kind of turns Anansi into a bit of a dupe here because he outwits the traps and is able to take the pig without setting the trap off. And then his reward is eating the pig. He takes the pig home for dinner and he eats the pig. So there's a representation of Anansi kind of being duped here by the black snake. This happens twice. Upon the second time that the black snake retrieves the pig from the trap, he actually encounters Anansi, and he questions Anansi about these traps. He's wondering why Anansi thinks that he can outsmart the black snake, because everyone knows that the black snake is equally as clever as Anansi. However, on the spot, Anansi comes up with a lie to manipulate the black snake. He tells him that the king was claiming that Mr. Yellowtail Snake is the longest snake. And Anansi wanted to defend Black Snake and correct the king and let him know that, no, Black Snake is actually the longest snake. And so he bets the king that he can prove that Black Snake is the longest snake. And he tells Black Snake that we can do this by you lying down and stretching yourself fully out to your full length, and then we will go to the king and prove him together that you are the longest snake. And so Black Snake actually falls for this because, like Anansi, Black Snake has his own vice, and his vice is pride. He's very proud of his length, and he wants to prove the king wrong. He wants to make it very clear that he is the longest snake. So he lays down on the ground, stretches himself out, but Anansi quickly ties him to a long pole in a way that he cannot escape. He ties him tightly to the pole, then he picks him up and he just takes him to the king himself. And obviously it's only to get stories named after himself. There's no bet, he's not trying to prove anything other than the fact that he can outwit the snake. This obviously turns Black Snake now into the dupe. So when he goes up there and he gives Black Snake to the king obviously grants Anansi's wish, and all stories become Anansi stories or Nansi stories because there are variations of his name. And so Anansi comes out no longer the dupe, and he gets his way in the end. And then the picture down here, it's just a picture of a black snake. I think it's actually a red-bellied black snake, but I just wanted to give kind of like a visual of what the snake might have looked like, just like the last image on the last slide. Observations about this myth. Anansi is representative of storytelling. So the metaphor is that the way that spiders weave webs, that is how storytellers weave tales. And you can see here on the picture that I have here on the slide on the lower left side, right side, there's Anansi with the humanoid characteristic of the head, the animal characteristic of the spider body, but behind him there's this patchwork design of spider web. And that is symbolic to the character Anansi. In a lot of Anansi art, you will see spider webs. He might be on a spider web, they might just be in the background as decor or however you want to see it, but there's a symbolism there. It is symbolic of Anansi representing the weaving of stories. And so they kind of go hand in hand, the spider web and the spider. The Master King in this story can refer to the slave or plantation owner, the slave owner, the plantation owner, while the character also can be represented by an African king or even the god who is in charge of naming things, because Anansi wants something to be named after him. So it has multiple representations, but because it is an African American trickster story and it's Master King, there is a metaphor there for the slave holder, the slave owner, versus the disempowered slave. And in the story, like I said before, about how the trickster functions in African American myths, it's about outwitting the slave master, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean triumphing over the slave master. It could just mean getting something from the slave master. And that's what's happening here in this story. Anansi does not overpower or triumph over Master King, but he is able to use his own cunning and wit to get something from the Master King. And he succeeds in this endeavor. So although the contracts and the Trickster contest are present here, just like they were present in the last story, we do see some differences about the motivations or the end goal of the story. The king and Anansi have a contract regarding Anansi tricking Blacksnake, and the king rewarding him with a desire to have stories named after him, and this is fulfilled within the story. Not all contracts are. A lot of the times, the contracts are actually broken specifically by the Trickster. And so Blacksnake and Anansi, they have a contract that they will prove to the king together that Blacksnake is the longest, that Blacksnake will be able to go with autonomy. However, obviously, like I said, Anansi breaks this contract. He was lying to Blacksnake from the beginning, and he essentially imprisons Blacksnake in a way and kidnaps him and takes him up to the king for the Trickster, Anansi's own gain. The Trickster contest is between Anansi and Blacksnake because they're both equally clever, and they are trying to outwit each other through this story with the traps, and the snake able to overcome the trap and just take the pig. Then Anansi manipulating and lying to the Blacksnake to get what he wants from him. It's a contest of those two clever, witty kind of trickster characters. The role of the dupe, just like in the last myth, is transferred here. There's a reversal of this role. At first, like I said, Anansi is duped, then at the end, the Blacksnake is actually the one that ends up duped. So what these two myths actually show us and tell us about African trickster myths and African American trickster myths is that there is endurance. These myths, the character, especially Anansi, survived the slave trade, survived that travel, and endured slavery and white supremacy. Even to this day, these myths are obviously still here. They still exist. So there's endurance there. And the trickster character, what he's trying to do and why he's trying to do it, there's slightly different motivations and there's slightly different expresses for him, different ways for him to go about this. And that's representative of the shifting kind of consciousness, right? So in Africa, it was focused on war and famine and natural disaster and things like that that cause scarcity and hardship. Whereas in America and in the West in general, it was slavery. So there's an outwitting of basically, I guess you could say, nature, using the dwarf to manipulate nature in order to achieve crop growth in the first myth, versus manipulating another character multiple characters in order to get what he wants in the African American trickster myth, the second one that I covered. So you can see kind of the difference there. And I particularly like these stories because Anansi is one of my favorite characters. I'll admit that he was the first African trickster I'd ever learned about, and so he's a bit nostalgic to me. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so that's basically everything. I really enjoyed covering these two myths. The last slide is just a citation slide and a thank you slide. Obviously, the citation, it's just the textbook, and the specific textbook chapter is chapter 25. Okay, thank you so much. I'm not a great speaker, so, I'm just trying to do this as well as I can. I know I say way too much, but thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to the presentation. I hope that it was informative, and I hope that it was somewhat enjoyable, at least the information and some of the images. Thank you.